it. Here we go. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So yes, I'm Taylor Meislish, a lecturer at Nagoya University of Foreign Studies, and focused on instructed pragmatics via corpus linguistics. Some of you present have contributed to mine and Christopher Ziffo's Speech Act corpus we're working on, so we thank you for your support. And today it's my honor to introduce Dr. Helen Spencer-Oatey, Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick. Among teachers and researchers interested in pragmatics, she's undoubtedly a familiar name, but for those who don't know her, I'll try to introduce her briefly. Dr. Spencer-Oatey is a distinguished researcher in social pragmatics, the interrelationship between language use and the management of interpersonal relations. Her work spans key areas such as face theory, politeness theory, and most notably, her very influential rapport management theory. Speaking for myself, but I believe also for many other educators and researchers in pragmatics, discovering her rapport management theory felt so clearly just like the next step we needed in pragmatics research. It addressed so many of the limitations of earlier politeness theories, such as the frequent assertion that these theories were too individualistic, static, and culturally biased. In her framework, she expanded beyond the narrow focus on face and microsocial factors like power, distance, and imposition, introducing concepts like sociality, rights and obligations, and rapport dynamics. Her model is both theoretically robust and highly adaptable, making pragmatics research and teaching more applicable and accessible worldwide. I cannot recommend her book, Culturally Speaking, highly enough. It's been an invaluable guiding resource for me in research and materials development for instructed pragmatics and helped me understand my own intercultural experiences. So Dr. Spencer-Oatey's insights stem from her extensive experience teaching and training educators in Hong Kong, China, and the UK, which shows her deep understanding of both research and practice. So I can think of no one better suited to explain the significance and teachability of pragmatics in our time than Dr. Spencer-Oatey. So please welcome her.
So thank you very much, Taylor, for that very kind introduction. Can everybody see my screen okay? Jason, yeah? Okay, good, good. So yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to join with you on at your symposium. And as you can see here, my title today is Achieving Mutual Understanding Across Languages and Cultures. And just to give you a bit of an outline of what I'm planning to do, first of all, say just a little bit of introductory background, why I got into this, and then a little bit of theory, not much, on interpreting what we mean by meaning and understanding. And then the main part of the talk will be on an actual case of misunderstanding. And Taylor talked about my work, and most recently this year I've published a new framework which is a little bit more applied. So I'll be using that in this talk. And then we'll move on to think how you could apply that in teaching. If we've got time, I'm not sure, we just mentioned where trips and culture come together, and then some pointers for follow-up reading. Okay, so Taylor mentioned that much of my career was in Hong Kong and China. So I'm going to give two examples that led me towards this route of looking at meaning, relationship management, etc. So early on in Shanghai, I was with a British Council program, a teacher training program. So I think when we say teacher training, I wonder what comes to your mind. So in terms of the dictionary, looked it up and it said the process of teaching or learning the skills you need to be a teacher in a school. Interestingly, the British Council and the Chinese Ministry of Education never asked each other, what do you understand by those teacher training skills? And believe it or not, the first whole year of the program was a misunderstanding because they hadn't clarified that. So in Britain, when we talk about teacher training, basically we mean teaching methodology. For the Chinese at that time, they meant improving language proficiency. So here we have a difference when we talk about meaning. what's in the dictionary and what in that particular context the word or the phrase actually means. And of course, from the Chinese point of view, they'd been at that time through the Cultural Revolution. People didn't have good English language skills. So the key need was actually English language training rather than methodology. Here's another example. When I first went to Hong Kong, I had no real experience of Chinese culture. Around lunchtime, I went to the bank to do some get some money or something, and I was served by a young man just a few years older than me, it seemed, and we did the transaction, and then he said, "Have you had lunch?" Now, I was really taken by surprise, because in England, if you ask somebody, "Have you had lunch?" it means, if you haven't had lunch, shall we go and have lunch together? And I thought, well, this is a complete stranger. Why is he asking me, as it were, to have lunch? And what I didn't realize was the difference. So the language code meaning is just literally, have you had lunch? But the functional meaning, in English, it's a pre-invitation. But in Chinese, it's just a greeting. And maybe the same in Japan, I'm not sure. And it's just friendliness and polite friendliness. So it was examples like these with misunderstandings that led me onto my journey. So I'm going to say now just a little bit of theory about meaning and understanding. Traditionally, people thought of the message model. One speaker, the man on the left, for example, decides he wants to convey a message. He encodes it into language. He speaks it, and the person over here on the right decodes the message and gets to the same message. That's a very old model, the message model. You can see Shannon Weaver first put it forward in 1949. And yet, this is still the model that is frequently referred to in business books in particular. So then we have to question, is that really, does that work? Now, they do say in the model that here, they call this, where I've put that sort of thing over sounds, that they call that noise. And noise could be physical noise in the environment or anything that interferes with the message meaning. But they don't go into that really in much detail. And so what actually happens in real life is what one person is intending to convey is not actually necessarily what the other person understands or interprets from it. So in pragmatics, we're interested in, why is that the case? What are the reasons behind it? And the reason is that it isn't simply a matter of encoding a message into language. It's much more complicated than that. So I put on the back here, yes, of course, we need a knowledge of the language code. And as language teachers, that is an important part of the use, but there's also conventions. So like, how do you greet somebody? Be friendly. In England, it's always think something like, oh, lovely day, isn't it? In China, it's, have you had lunch? So different conventions. Then you have background knowledge, general knowledge, technical knowledge. We can often find that technicians can communicate really well together often because they've got that background knowledge. We then would talk about things like the context, who the people are, their relationship. And of course, and this would be, for those of you in pragmatics relevance theory, that we need to also be aware of the other person's needs, background knowledge, etc. And so what we could say is message is not so much encoded as constructed. And the other person is interpreting the message. And different people may interpret that same message differently depending on their interests, their background knowledge, etc. So if we come back then to think, okay, about meaning and mutual understanding, we can say there are different types of meaning. There's the dictionary definition, the literal meaning. I've put here the language code meaning. We can have meaning in a particular context, like the teacher training. What did teacher training mean? Because of the historical and context there. Functional meaning. And all of those build up to message meaning. But because that meaning is co-constructed, like I showed you in the previous slide, that can result in message meaning misunderstandings. Very early on, though, in communication theory, it was realized that actually communication isn't only giving messages about information, it's also at the same time, as it were, giving messages about relationships. And so we could also talk about relational meaning. So that co-construction can also lead to relational misunderstandings. So we saw, like with the bank example, and have you had lunch? I was very confused from that. So when we talk about mutual understanding, ideally, it involves both the message meaning and relational meaning. So as teachers, we need to not only be concerned about helping students convey and interpret the right message meaning, but also manage relationships. And of course, in Japan, politeness is so important, as of course it is in all countries. So just going to give you some quotes here. This is an older one. The key notion is not understanding, but coming to an understanding on an interactive level. In other words, we work out meaning, and sometimes we do that on an ongoing basis. Troy McConaughey and Tony Liddicoat say understanding should be seen as a process rather than a state, as a process of engagement that is forever in development. And they also say it's engagement with the plurality of interpretation that lies at the heart of intercultural understanding. And these are really important points, I think. Sometimes, you know, we have that sense, am I right, or did I understand that right, you know, in the right way? This is the problem, and we know that even in our own language, in our own culture, we have misunderstandings because there isn't always one interpretation because of all that co-construction that's going on. So, okay, now what I want to do is to analyze a case study of misunderstanding, and to introduce you to the TRIPS framework, which I believe will hopefully, Taylor, you will find it even more useful than the rest of you in your teaching. So my aim for this is to provide a framework that will help us understand why and how misunderstandings can occur, both in message meaning and relational meaning. I've put the two books there because these are the two latest ones that are more professionally oriented rather than sort of academic. And I hope it will be useful for teachers in helping others handle the interpretation process more successfully. And I will especially be thinking of appropriateness, or that rapport relationship management side. And I want to use a case study to help us with this. Okay, so one of my students gave me this example that she experienced volunteering at an international summer camp in China with primary school children. So a group of participants, that is their primary school children and their teachers, were due to arrive one morning in another part of China and have classes in the afternoon. but they didn't arrive until early evening. One of the Chinese volunteers, we'll call her Xiao Li, was told to take 2 of the international volunteer teachers to meet the children and say hello to them. She did so. And in brackets, Xiao Li had already started to develop a friendship with the volunteer teachers. So the international teachers went and they introduced themselves to the children, spent a few minutes with them, and then planned to leave. But the camp organizers wanted the teachers to stay longer and kept asking them to interact more with the children. The 2 teachers were annoyed because they didn't think they should stay that long. And the staff from the school weren't happy either. And then afterwards, one of the teachers said to Xiao Li, "Be careful when you speak to Western people. When you ask us to say hello to the children, we just say hello. If you want us to give a class, we need preparation, and then we can give a really good one." Xiao Li commented afterwards, "I was surprised upon hearing her words. Although I didn't say anything, I felt a bit annoyed and frustrated." Okay. So we've got 3 groups of people, the camp organizers, the Xiao Li, and then there were a couple of international volunteers. So we can say, what went wrong? Why was everyone upset or annoyed? All of them were upset and annoyed about the situation. And hopefully, I'm going to use the TRIPS framework so we can look at it from each person's perspective, because obviously, often we tend to just look at it from our own perspective. And from that point of view, I want to introduce the TRIPS. TRIPS is an acronym that I'm using for the 5 key things that are involved in communication. And at the center of that is interactions. And what I do is I'll talk about interactions and then go through each of these so we can see how it could help. So as I say, of course, interaction, that is what is said and done. The core of what we are doing as teachers is at the center. So if you think here, the instructions were to say hello. So we could say, what's the language code meaning? What's the contextual meaning? What's the functional meaning of this? And if we look at the Xiao Li and the international volunteer teachers, language code meaning is literally that, say hello. Contextual meaning, we could see meet the children briefly, and functional meaning, introduce yourselves briefly to the children. So that you might think was obvious. But for the camp organizers, their functional meaning was a bit different. So still the language code meaning the same, contextual meaning, meet the children, but they didn't think briefly. And it was actually teach an initial class. So what were the reactions to those interpretations, or different interpretations of meaning, partially different? Now, with reactions, it's important to think there's 2 aspects. There's the emotional reaction, like we get surprised or annoyed or upset. And then evaluative reactions, that's often we make judgments about people and we say things like, oh, she was rude or she was unhelpful and so on. So if we think of the reactions, the camp staff reactions towards the international teachers, they were irritated, they were annoyed, they were dissatisfied. We weren't told how they evaluated them, but one could guess that they were seeing them as incompetent or maybe not responsible. And then the international teachers' reactions towards the Xiao Li and the camp organizers, they were annoyed, definitely. Again, we're not told about their evaluations, but again, the overall impression is that they were negative towards them. So that you had for that initial say hello and in the actual session. And then afterwards, as we saw in the case study, one of the international volunteers says, be careful when you speak to Western people. Notice seeing it as a cultural thing. When you ask us to say hello to the children, we just say hello. If you want us to give a class, we need preparation, and we can give a really good one. Xiaoli's reaction then, she says that in her own words, she was annoyed, she was frustrated, she was actually offended because she thought she'd got quite a good relationship and she thought they were too blunt. She was embarrassed, but she covered up her emotions. She didn't show them. And she felt that she had been blamed unfairly. So, why? If we want to dig deeper, I believe that the trips and the trigger analysis can help us. So, was culture to blame, as that volunteer implied? So I think we can, if we go to the triggers, we can understand in more detail why people were upset and to what extent it was cultural or not. So we've looked at interactions, which is the core. We've looked at the reactions. So now, and this is the new part of my theory, although draws on a lot of previous pragmatic work. So triggers are the issues that trigger some kind of rapport reaction. I've called them the GAF triggers, again, another acronym to show these are sensitivities that lead to a negative reaction if the interaction isn't handled well. So I'm going to go through them in turn, just so you can understand them a little bit better. Goals. Those of you who are familiar with my rapport management theory will know that goals has always been there in my framework. Goals, we all have goals. You have some goals, presumably for attending this session. If something happened and I wasn't talking about the topic at all and your goal was frustrated, wasn't met, you might be frustrated. So we all have goals. If our goals aren't met, then our rapport, the relationship can be affected. Key here, though, often we don't even know what somebody else's goals are. So that's an interesting thing. Then the next, autonomy. Now, those of you, again, in pragmatics with Brown and Levinson's notion of imposition. So in psychology, there is a key dimension, which is autonomy versus control. And on the whole, we like to have some freedom and be autonomous. But on the other hand, we also like direction. And of course, in hierarchical relationships, we're often told what to do. So getting that balance between autonomy and control and direction can be problematic. Attention, we all like to be, we don't like to be ignored. But on the other hand, we don't like to be overly familiar, somebody to be unwantedly over familiar. So those of you familiar with culturally speaking, I talked about association rights. Yeah, then you've got face. Sorry, let me go on to the next one, which I'm sure you're familiar with that. Are we being given enough respect and appreciation and so on? Fairness, this would count as equity rights in my other framework. So are we being treated fairly or unfairly? And then ethical principles, is it ethical? Sometimes we're asked to do things that we actually feel are unethical. And in recent pragmatic theory, that's often referred to as the moral order, although it could be broader. So these are the 6 things which I feel are triggers that if any of these, and often in combination, it's not just one or the other, one of them, it's often in combination, that can give rise to problems. So if we go on and think of the say hello session, the session with the actual primary school students, and we think from the camp organizers' point of view, their goals were a positive experience for the participants. Now, it's interesting because when I first saw this, I thought, gosh, these are primary school children. They've been traveling all day. They'll be tired. Why would they go and would be insisting that they have a class in the evening? They're only primary school children. But anyway, there were various goals, also thinking not just the participants, but also the children, but their parents. So their key goal was positive experience. They also believed, we're the camp organizers, we can tell you what to do. Your role is to just follow our instructions and do as we're told, as you're told. For the international volunteers, however, they were not expecting that level of control over their time. They had been told, say hello. They thought that meant briefly meet the students. So when they were told, stay longer, stay longer, stay longer, they felt their autonomy had been compromised. I think they also probably felt a sense of concern over fairness, lack of notice, lack of clear instruction, so felt that was unfair. And also you could tell from their comment to Xiao Li, they probably felt it was a threat to their teaching competence, because they'd been suddenly asked to stay longer and they hadn't prepared at all. And what we have with rapport is when there is misalignment in these, then you will get problems with rapport or with relationships work. So that misalignment can be, you've got goals here, and then unawareness of what the goals were from the international volunteers. They didn't really understand the camp organizers' goals. But you've also got a different kind of mismatch here, where the preference for, when it's a scale, how much autonomy or how much control. So what we've got here is quite a mismatch, hence the relationship, the annoyance they felt. So then if we go on to that follow-up comment by one of the international volunteers, be careful when you speak to Western people. When you ask us to say hello to the children, we just say hello. If you want us to give a class, we need preparation, and we can give a really good one. Now, Xiao Li reflected on that, and she said, my frustration is mainly because of 3 reasons. I considered myself to be innocent, since I was just doing what I was told, and I shouldn't be the one to be blamed. Since I'd spent some time with the foreign teachers, I thought I built some friendship with her, but her words to some extent offensive and really hurt my feelings. I also felt embarrassed since the situation was not handled well by our organizer. So she was upset for a number of reasons. And again, if we look at it from this point of view, you notice she first had that sense of fairness. It wasn't my fault. I just did what I was told. Her face was also threatened. She felt she'd been personally criticized. But she also felt it showed the organizers in the bad light. And since she was Chinese, they were Chinese, she felt a sort of group face threat as well. But if you look at it from the international volunteers' perspective, this would be my interpretation anyway. They wanted to reduce the risk of unclear instructions in the future and its impact on teaching quality. So basically, they were saying, your words, say hello, were not clear to us. So in future, if you want us to do a good job, make sure you tell us things clearly. So, okay, so we've looked at interactions and the confusion there, the reactions, and then we've seen various mismatches in the triggers that were giving rise to people's varying negative reactions. But those of you who do anything in pragmatics will know you always have to take the context into consideration. And here we need always to think, well, who are these people and their roles and relationships, and what about the settings? So I'm just going to briefly talk about that. So the participants, there's always quite a lot of aspects of this, the number of people, people's nationalities and language proficiency. So we could ask, how relevant was this here? As we've seen, the international volunteers pitched it as Western versus Chinese, or Western versus Asian. But notice, Xiaoli and the camp organizers were all Chinese. So there was a misunderstanding actually between Xiaoli and the camp organizers, even though they're all Chinese. So it's not wise to automatically jump, and we'll come back to that later, to putting things down to culture. We always need to think participant relations unequal, but probably the international volunteers didn't see it as being quite as unequal as perhaps the camp organizers did. Distance, closeness. Xiaoli was disappointed that the international volunteers didn't take this into account. She thought, I formed a friendship with them already. I've got to know them. Why are they treating me as we Westerners, you Chinese? And then you've got role responsibilities, levels of authority. This links, of course, to hierarchical relationships, work-related rights and obligations. The camp organizers felt they had the right to give instructions to the volunteers. The volunteers felt, okay, but don't boss us around too much. You've got to be fair in how you give us those instructions. And then if we think of settings, what is important, I think, with settings is to see it's always multi-level and one inside another. In pragmatics, we tend to focus on the communication context, the actual interaction setting. In the intercultural world, they tend to focus on the societal, the national level. Actually, you've got multiple levels there that need to be taken into account. So the interaction setting, an international summer camp. What are the normal arrangements for this type of communicative event? How is the teaching arranged? Are there any rules or conventions? As I said, I was a bit surprised that the teachers were being asked to teach a class in the evening to primary school children after they'd been traveling all day. And I talked with a Chinese colleague about that, and she said the thing is the parents pay a lot of money for these kinds of summer camps, and if the parents thought they weren't getting as much teaching as they paid for, they would complain. So this is probably something to do with the organizational setting. And of course, as outsiders, for me, I'm not familiar with international summer camps. somebody who was listening, who has also heard this story, said, actually, these kinds of issues happen quite a lot. And then, of course, you've got the national setting, China. So any communication, you need to look at these multiple levels. Don't have a chance to go into the detail, but the interaction setting is an important one that needs to be taken into account. Okay, so then that is all I want to say about the case study, but now we need to go on and think, how now could you actually apply this to teaching? So again, we'll go through these. So the interactions, the message content, the communication style, the communication dynamics, things like this, turn taking. It seems to me there will always be differences in communication style, things like directness, indirectness, both within and across languages. So to me, the key message here is to use meaning checks. So, for example, if I was doing this face-to-face rather than online via Zoom, I would be watching people's faces, getting clues as to whether they were looking confused or not. And I might ask, do you follow what I mean? They might not say, but I would be picking up on cues to try and make sure to be checking, are people following me? This is one of the problems with Zooms. I can't see any of you, so I'm just giving one-sided thing. I can see Jason, I can see Taylor, and I see them nodding from time to time, and this is giving me cues back. But also, really important, and this is what failed with this example, check on other people's intended meaning. So it could be just a repetition request if you haven't heard it or understood it properly. But perhaps particularly important, clarification request. Ask for further explanation of something that is not clear, or you just want to be sure. So now, right at the beginning, I gave you the example of teacher training. British Council never asked the Ministry of Education, Chinese Ministry of Education, what do you mean by teacher training? And the Chinese Ministry of Education never asked the British Council, what do you mean by teacher training? Just recently, I was talking with a publisher, actually, and he said to me, oh, we are very active in our editing. And I thought, oh, so I thought, okay, how do I understand editing? For me, editing, when you're publishing a book, there's a commissioning editor who decides whether they're going to publish the book. And then there's a copy editor who, when you have actually written the manuscript and they're checking through. But I thought, I don't think he's really meaning that. So I had to ask him, here we, both in Britain, what do you mean by editing? And his understanding of editing was quite different from my understanding of editing. So even when we are familiar with the words, if we are from, when I say different cultural backgrounds, I mean, here we are talking about professional. I'm used to academic worlds and publishers from journal publishing and so on. He was used to business publishing. So we were in different professional cultures, you might say. And if it's a different national culture or some other kind of cultural group, we may know the word in our own setting, but not in another. So that clarification request is really important. And another one could be confirmation. Do you mean, so going back and say, okay, this is how I understood that. Is that what you meant? So these two are really important. In the literature, there's another one, let it pass, ignore the problem. We may do that sometimes, but if we completely ignore it, we get into dangerous territory, as we saw in this particular example. So if we think, so for the interaction, what I'm saying here is, I mean, this is just one example. Do these clarification checks and train your students to do that. It's not a sign of language proficiency weakness. It's sensible in many contexts. We've got other things in our book about things like turn taking and other styles, but I don't have time to talk about that now. Reactions, then emotional reactions, evaluative reactions. This is not something that we necessarily cover very much usually in language teaching. But actually, why would we analyze reactions? Well, managing emotions is actually really important for relationship management, because if we don't work through them, we can feel annoyed with that person and it can fester. Clarifying emotions to ourselves, that is, I don't mean to say to the other person, can in itself help to reduce their intensity. So thinking through, and I have found for myself, working through the triggers and thinking, okay, why have I felt annoyed? What is it that's triggered my reactions is really helpful. What emotions am I really feeling? And all the work on emotional intelligence encourages you to do that. And it also helps then understand different people's perspectives. If we go through the triggers, we can see, okay, why different people reacted in different ways. And in our book, we've got a conceptual framework where we talk, where you can help you analyze your different emotions. And then, as I say, the triggers, it helps us understand why people are upset or annoyed and reduces the risk of cultural stereotyping. So, and it's useful in two ways: for reflecting back on something that happened that has annoyed us or upset us, but it's also useful for thinking forward, you know, finding out what people's goals are and taking them into account. For thinking how much autonomy or how much control or direction, what balance should I get? What's the balance between attention and non-attention? What might be upsetting to people's face, their level of directness or of criticism, for example? What about treating people fairly? And of course, as teachers, that's often a difficult thing. What about upholding ethical standards? That may not, you may think that doesn't happen a lot, but actually, certainly here in Britain and in other places, things like toxic workplaces are a big issue. And so ethics are also really important. So we've had interactions and clarification. We've had, it's important, don't ignore the reactions, think them through. And if you go work through the triggers, this will help to soften the evaluative reactions and also our emotions. But as we also said, the context, the people, the settings are important, have a crucial influence in intercultural interaction, particularly common for different interpretations of hierarchy. I think I found that certainly in China, that it was, people were very sensitive to hierarchical relations, but actually this is worldwide, I think. Interpretation of distance, closeness, what that means. And here's another big one, role responsibilities. What are the role responsibilities of a teacher? Lots of cultural differences there, actually. And then in terms, those are all people factors, setting factors, norms for communicative events like meetings or even in class. Who can speak when? Do students have to put their hands up? can teachers just pick on any student and so on? So, and then there's organizational culture norms. So there's a lot of setting factors that interact with people factors that then in turn will influence interaction and the triggers and the reactions. Okay, so this is a lot for you to take in, but let me just say a little bit about trips and culture. Traditionally in the intercultural field, it was saying mostly nationality, a bit of organizational culture would influence cultural values and norms, and that would give to differences in behavior and potential misunderstandings. One of the problems with that is that this is too limited, that nowadays it would be seen as we have multiple cultural identities that are, it's a complex mix. Some people talk about the mosaic of culture, which I quite like. So in my view, culture is sort of framing and permeating all of this, and that it's best to start with interactions rather than the national culture is down here in the settings. But actually, as we have seen, it actually permeates everything and in complex ways, because each of us is a member of multiple cultures. So, for instance, the setting, yes, there will be different norms and expectations, but especially for communicative event. If you're not familiar with that, there's in my books we talk about that. That's really important, because communicative events have a lot of expectations associated with them. And then, of course, you do get societal norms, like norms over greetings, etc. You've then got the people, as we talked about, perceptions of hierarchy, role, responsibilities. The values from here will influence these, but not in a simple way. Then you do have different styles. The international volunteer who made that comment to Xiaoli was German, and that brings up the stereotype. And it's true to a certain extent that some cultural groups may be seen, generally speaking, as more direct, but of course it's more complex than that. And it's also influenced by setting. I found people will often say Chinese are very indirect, but actually it depends on the context. And so it will influence, but not in a simple way. Reactions, you do have cultural differences over the acceptability of showing emotional reaction, and triggers, there will be culture there, maybe. So basically what I'm saying is, in this, I would not recommend going from the national culture and trying to explain it there, but actually doing this more nuanced interpretation. Okay, conscious of time, so quick follow-up. If you want to follow up, especially on the meaning across cultures, the Global Fitness book, we deal with things like knowledge and understanding, communication skills, rapport management, lots of stories, case studies, critical incidents, all of them authentic. And each chapter ends with key takeaways, easy to read. Then we've got the latest one, Making Working Relationships Work. It explains this TRIPS framework, lots of background information, like on emotions, lots on participation, turn taking. Again, full of authentic case studies, lots of activities for reflection. And we've got numerous tools and templates which you can use. So there's also in the back of the book where you can use them in class or for training sessions. Also, on our website here, globalpeopleconsulting.com, there's lots of free resources. I've got blog type articles, core concept papers, things which are just quotes from other sources, like on what is culture, what is mindfulness, etc. And then there's a few research insights. We also offer some courses on certified training. So if you want to know more, just get in touch. You can get me at my work email at Warwick. I'm retired from there now, so I'm an emeritus professor, but also Helen at globalpeopleconsulting.com. But now, if you have any questions, I'll stop sharing and you're very welcome to ask them.
Thank you very much. Can we get everybody on camera to give a round of applause? Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now for anybody who wants to